For today's video, we are going to make a schedule triggered flow that runs on a monthly basis and that can be activated from outside the flow builder. So I have my Lightning Flow Builder open. As you can see in the schedule triggered flow settings, we can only do once daily or weekly. So the solution that we're coming up with today is about figuring out how to do it monthly without having to go in and schedule it at a one-time frequency every single month. Let's go back to setup. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a custom trigger object. So I will just call it a trigger record. Don't need reports or activities, deployed. Let's launch the custom tab wizard because that'll just make this a little easier. Okay, and let's pick, I guess the alarm clock is a good one. Just ignore this since this is my dev org, so none of this matters. And save. Okay, so now that we have the trigger object, which is what the flow will use to actually figure out when to run, let's come up with our core fields. So in this case, the only things I'm really concerned about are date. So this date field will be used to tell the flow when to actually run. Let's also use a checkbox field so that we can mark when a trigger record is active or inactive. And just for demonstration's sake and for being organized, let's capture what kind of trigger this record would be. So I am going to call this a trigger type pick list field. And let's just say for this upsell thing, it's a sales process, but maybe we have triggers for other things. Okay, perfect. Let's make sure our layouts look decent and have all of our fields. Yep, good enough for me. And let's go create our trigger record now. So I will call this record create upsell tasks each month. So let's say our next flow run date is today. Let's mark this as active and let's categorize it as a sales type. Okay, so now that we have that, what I'm doing right now, which you can't see, is I'm copying the record ID from the URL. Now let's go back into our flow and let's change our settings. So instead of running on the account object, oh, actually, let's refresh since I had this open before. Instead of running on the account object, we'll want to run this on our trigger object instead. And only for trigger records where that active checkbox is true, right?
Hey, Editing D here. I'm realizing that I forgot to add a filter condition that fires on our specific trigger record. So in reality, the start condition should look for trigger records where the active checkbox is true and where the ID matches the record ID that we copied earlier from our trigger record. Okay, back to the video.
So instead of going straight from our trigger record to our task creation record, we'll need to add a decision step. So for this element, what we'll do is we'll basically check to see if the trigger record that's being pulled into the flow has a flow trigger date that matches the current flow run date. Hopefully that makes sense. So if it doesn't, let's say flow trigger is today. If the outcome is yes, so now our flow record is the trigger object, not the account object anymore. So let's look for that date field. Flow run date equals, and then let's look at our flow run date. So again, we're seeing if the trigger record that is currently being pulled into the scheduled flow, if the flow run date on that record matches the run date of the flow. Put another way, because I realize how many words I just repeated in one sentence, we are looking to see if this field matches whatever day the actual flow here decides to run. And then our default outcome would be no, there is no match. Okay, so if our flow trigger date does match this yes path, that's when we actually want to do this task. So I'm going to do it the not great way and just copy and paste it because that's just really easy. This is only one element. And again, if the flow trigger date doesn't match, we just want the flow to end.
So we started with a flow that ran on the account object, and we changed it to run on the trigger object. So now the rest of the flow is actually incompatible with what we want it to achieve, which is creating those task records. So we'll have to go back and add a few elements to get it to work the way that it's supposed to.
Let's just do a get records. It's probably easiest. Get accounts with upsell opportunity. So we want to get all accounts where the upsell opportunity is yes. We'll get all the records, choose fields, and let Salesforce do the rest. I just find that this is an easier way to debug rather than having every single possible field on the account. I'm just working with the ones that I need. So I'll hit done. And then since this is actually creating a collection element, so since this is getting multiple account records, we'll need to do a loop to actually create all of our tasks. So we'll loop through bound accounts. The collection variable we're looping through is all of the records from that get records element that we just added. And then this is a little off scope, but bulkification is important here. So instead of dragging this element up into our loop, that goes against Salesforce best practice. What we'll do is we'll use an assignment element to actually create all of our tasks. Let's create a record variable for each individual task. That's probably the easiest way. Okay, so now that we have this single record variable, I will assign all of the values for the fields that we need in our new task records. So our due date. And I already have a formula for our due date, so I'll just plug that in. It'll be 5 days after the flow run date, just to make it easy for the demo. We'll also do our subject. Reach out to customer about. Keep it easy. Let's do our assigned to. And let's just set that to be the current account in the loop, the owner of that account. Let's make it easy. And I think, was that everything that we assigned? Oh, right, the what ID. So the last thing that I almost forgot to assign is the actual related to. So this is the field that you would use to relate a task to an account. So let's say it's the current loop item ID. Okay, going a little fast. Hopefully that all made sense. So I'll hit done and save again. And then the final thing that we need to do, so for every account that this element gets, we want to prepare to create a task record. And before we can actually push those tasks into Salesforce and create the actual records, we need to add them all to a collection variable. So we will create that right now. So this is exactly like what we did before to create the individual record variable, except now we'll do allow multiple values. Whoops. Done. So we're back to our assignment element. So basically for every time that we have our tasks going through that loop, we want to make sure that we add that new record into our record collection. So let's find our single record for tasks. Save again. And then this is where bulkification comes in. So the final step is actually creating your records in Salesforce. But instead of using all of these things that we had before, since we're creating multiple records at a time now, we'll hit multiple and then we'll add our collection here. So basically this is saying all of the task records that we threw into this bucket, let's now create them in Salesforce. So done. But there's one other thing that we should do, and that's actually updating our trigger record. And by the way, sometimes you'll see me actually name my API names properly, and other times I'll just take the default. I usually just do the default for videos like this, or if I'm trying to show something. In my real life, I always take the time to try to write clear API names. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually update the trigger record that has kicked off this flow, right? And we want to change the flow run date to be the next month. Since dates are confusing, I'm just going to talk you through my full process. I'm not just going to drop the formula in here. But basically, we needed to grab the flow run date, right? So we want the run date to be the next month from whatever the current run date is. So we will do date using the date formula. And the date formula is year, comma, month, comma, day. So we will do the year of the flow run date. The month of the flow run date plus 1, and then the day of the flow run date. Okay, so on its face, this works. But if your flow run date happens to be in December, for example, this won't work because it will try to make your flow run date in the current year with the month 13, and that's just not doable. So instead, let's say if the month of the flow run date, whoops. By the way, I'm just copying and pasting. If the month of the flow run date is less than 12, then we want to do this formula. Otherwise, if it's not less than 12, then it's equal to 12, right? So otherwise, what we want to do is say the next flow run date should be the year plus 1, next January. The month would be January, so we can just make this 1. And then we can keep the day as is. And then let's close out our if statement.
And technically, even this formula isn't foolproof. My guess is you would get some sort of error if you were dealing with leap years or working with monthly trigger dates that run at the very end of the month, that 30 versus 31 day difference. But for the sake of the video, we're just going to roll with it.
Hopefully that works and we don't get errors, but let's see. Hit save. Ah, that usually doesn't happen so easily. Okay. So there we go. So again, we have our flow run date set for today, which means that when I actually run my scheduled flow, and because of the time, what it is right now, I'm actually going to run it for 9 o'clock, which is in 3 minutes. And we'll set this to daily just for demo's sake. Hit save. And because I actually just debugged this separately, I realized that I am missing my owner ID from this get records element, so my flow would not have worked. Okay, so let's save that, debug it. Okay, that seems to work. 9 o'clock is coming up in 2 minutes, so I am going to activate my flow. A few things should happen. So once that flow runs, this flow run date should be set to the next month, which is February 24th. And we should be able to see new task records for our upsell accounts. Okay, so it's now 9 o'clock. So I'm going to refresh my trigger record and see if that flow run date changed. Oh, and it did. Okay, so this is a pretty good indicator that the flow ran smoothly, but let's look for our tasks just to make sure. So I guess we can do open. Yep, and so you can see our task records created. We have that subject line that we set. These are all 4 accounts in my dev org that have an upsell opportunity equal to yes, and our due date, which remember we said would be 5 days after the flow run date. So obviously you can set whatever dates you prefer. The nice thing about this solution, if it wasn't totally obvious is that we can always manually change these dates. So that could be you, that could be an end user. And as long as your flow is set to run on a daily basis at the right time, then your flow should always run. So in a real setting, I wouldn't set this to 9 o'clock. I would probably set this to be something a little ridiculous, like 12:30 a.m. And then basically with this logic, the trigger date would just have to be set at least one day before in order for it to run properly. So overall, I think this is a pretty decent solution if you need something that runs on a monthly basis, but you don't want to go into your flow and create 50 million versions just to activate your flow every single time. And like I said earlier, if you have an end user who can kick off your scheduled flows, meaning you can go take a vacation or whatever else, that's a win too. Keep in mind, this works for me. This works at my real life org because our database is still relatively small. I'm not totally sure what the limits are when it comes to scheduled flows, but if you're working with hundreds of thousands of records, or if you have a lot of scheduled flows running on a daily basis, you'll just want to make sure that those won't break or fail because of this setup. So that's it. Thanks for watching.